They're going to talk a little bit about understanding Indiana reserves.
Check, check. I'll go with them. Hochicheke, Ninga Ninga. Cam, Winsweani, Ila Schmalsa, Lona Teheane, She Mitoseniwangwe, Totamangwe, Tepewe Tehiani, Epiani Waha, Unana Doug. So this project is, my involvement in this project is now in the end of its second year. The goal for me, as the tribe suggested, was to understand really, because we've done a lot of work understanding the reservation and allotment process in Oklahoma and in Kansas, now to take that back in time and back into Indiana and understand all of the reserve lands of the Myaamia people in Indiana, how those lands were acquired, and how and when and to whom they were sold, which is a big project. And it's largely a 19th century project that is in the 1800s. So we're going to talk about that today. Primarily thinking about three key questions. The first is what lands, that is where did Myaamiaki own land in Indiana through the treaty process. Second question is how, or maybe the better question is then why did Myaamiaki acquire and relinquish that land over time, over the long term. And thirdly, and I'll leave this largely to Doug, is how can we best tell, once we understand all of that, which is the goal, which we don't understand totally yet, how can we best tell or use this tool to tell the story of these questions? How can we, not just me, but we in this room and beyond, kind of populate these maps with stories about land ownership and land loss over time, of course. So the first question is, what lands did Myaamiaki own in Indiana? And we've answered this question, and I'll show you through a series of maps. And it's really a story of treaties with the United States, of course, as you may know. Beginning in 1795, and the last treaty that I'm concerned with is in 1840, but we can map the lands that Myaamiaki ceded, that is sold through the treaty process to the United States, in a series of maps pretty accurately. First in 1795, moving through to 1818. This is the first treaty of 5 where Miami people, in addition to ceding land, then begin to create reserves out of those ceded lands. So 5 treaties between 1818 and 1840 are those family and individual reserves that I'm going to really focus on, that a lot of your families have more intricate stories about those lands. By 1840, we can see that most of what is Myaamiaki in the 19th century is ceded to the United States. And this is similar to Michikanaka's statement of territorial sovereignty in 1795. This is the area that he said, this is the lands of the Miami Nation, or my forefathers, as he put it. This is mapped onto Myaamiaki. This is what Little Turtle said is the Miami Nation. So we can account for the cession of most land to the United States, that is most of Myaamiaki, through the series of treaties between 1818, really 1795 and 1840. However, what's more intricate and I think interesting, and we're thinking about, are these lands that are reserved, that is really Miami reservations. So it's a story of land ownership as well as just land loss. This is a map of all Miami lands in the 19th century. In pink, it doesn't show up quite as well here, but these kind of pink reserves are communal reserves. That's one category of reserve. That is reservations for the Miami tribe as an entire community, communal. And for example, these are in the treaty language. These are reserved for the use of the Miami tribe. This example from the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818 on Echipongwawisipi, which is just one of the small reserves here. So communal reserves are one category of reserve that are held by the entire tribe, and all of these were ceded through treaties to the United States. I think is generally known. That leaves these individual reserves that are in purple. There are 109 individual reserves that Miami people acquired through treaties with the United States. So the United States says, this is your land, this is your land, this is your family's land. And there are 109 of those reserves. Some of them are granted in fee simple, but many of them are granted as what they called Indian title, which means that the president has to agree for your ancestors to sell that land, which the president always did. Like Andrew Jackson said, sure, that sounds good. You can sell it, no problem. So there are 109 of these. And the real work comes in because these lands were sold or willed through time in going to literally county by county courthouses in the recorder's office, looking for Myaamia names, seeing when they sold parcels of land over time. So certainly probably tens of thousands of land sales is represented here, and we're getting close to literally cataloging each one, which will be a nice map to have. For example, an individual reserve. In the treaty, the language might look like this. So to Makatamangwa, one section of land to be located on the Wabash River. The upper line of that part of the big reserve ceded earlier in that same treaty. And this land, this Black Loon land, is in this little cluster here. So it's a story of land loss, but also kind of a story of land retention over time as well. So we know where these reserves were. I think a related question is, why did this happen? Because I think this story of individual Indian reserves, which the Miami are a big example of, there are a lot of Potawatomi reserves, individual reserves, but, for example, not a lot of Shawnee individual reserves, or Ottawa individual reserves. So why did this happen with the Miami and Potawatomi and Creeks, but not with the Comanches or something? So this is where I am a bit speculative, and I'll put forth the knowledge that I have, and we should continue to think about why Miami people or the US government would negotiate these types of things. Let me move back. So what I've been able to find is that Miami people acquiring these 109 individual reserves really dismayed white administrators in Washington because they feared that these private properties would obstruct a future removal, logically. And there are multiple ironies here. For example, the Secretary of War, he allowed treaty commissioners to grant individual reservations if it would soften those Myaamaki to an eventual removal. So, fine, we'll give you individual reserves if you then leave. Commissioners 4 years later, it's in 1834. Commissioners 4 years later remained really wary of patenting these land to individuals, but the chiefs demanded them. One treaty negotiator offered his opinion because he had to account for his giving these individual reserves to Miami people or allowing them to be reserved. He said the reserves are usually sold by the Myaamia grantee before the ratification of the treaty under which they are granted and occupied by whites before the country around them is brought into market. So some of these individual reserves were actually sold to white folks before that land was acquired by the United States, put in the land office, and then a white person goes to the land office, says, I'll take that land. A Miami person might sell it within a year, whereas it might take 10 years for it to go through the other process, sometimes. So we thought this was fine. The same year, Abel Pepper explained why the Miami community required so many. This 1838 treaty ceded land to the U.S., but it also guaranteed a small communal reserve, as well as 44 individual reserves that are granted to 29 different folks, Miami people, that is. Pepper, this commissioner, claimed that he couldn't have negotiated fewer reserves which were made with the general consent of the Indians. Custom makes it necessary that these chiefs and headmen should maintain an open hand to the poor and destitute of their people, that they should feed and clothe them and extend to them the comforts of their wigwams whenever an appeal is made to their benevolence. In selling their lands, they look for reservations to be accorded them in recompense for these acts of charity and public service. That's what the commissioner thought. We should note that 4 women also gained reserves in this treaty, so it wasn't only head men. There are women who acquire these reserves as well. 2 years later, there's a different treaty, Again, it revealed that Pinjua, as John Baptiste Richardville, his land scattered throughout Myaamia territories, which, they said, allowed him to do justice to individuals of the tribe who heretofore have not received a due share of the money arising from former sales of their land. Now, Pinjua was, according to them, a common benefactor of his people. He owned, as you can tell, by far the most number of square miles of any Myaamia person throughout the treaty process. 45 and a quarter sections of land he acquired as his own individual reserves. While he was acquiring private property in the U.S. legal sense, Pinjua also allowed tribal members to live on his reserves. Just after removing to Kansas, the chiefs wrote back that several individuals of our tribe were in possession of large tracts of land reserved for them in different treaties, and these reserves could answer all the purposes of the inconsiderable remnants of a once powerful tribe. So I think there, at least based on this letter, there is some argument or understanding by the Myaamaki in Kansas that we had enough land to stay on these individual reserves. So this data is only available really in Excel form, which is difficult to get at. We're working on developing this so that people can really get their own hands into the data and ask new questions for themselves and help us understand it better, help us understand what questions we should be asking. But you can tell that essentially the well-known Myaamaki got most of the land. Talking about the Godfroys brothers, Pinjua, LaFontaine, Tupia. Just to give you a sense of how much land John Baptiste Richardville had, this is 45 and a quarter square miles over Ottawa County. And if you're from Fort Wayne, this is kind of the amount of land that we're talking about. Most folks just got a section or two or less. So we're starting to I'm starting to try to analyze some of this data and understand trends that were not apparent to people at the time or that they didn't write about. So we can analyze data in the aggregate rather than just letters back and forth. For example, of the treaty sections, of those sections that Miami people had and sold whole, that is, if you get one section, you sell that entire section. You don't just sell 1 acre of it. That is only 55 of the 109 reserves were sold whole cloth. So less than half were sold as an entire section. Does that make sense? Most of them were split up and sold piecemeal. But of those 55 that are sold whole, you can see that over time it appears that folks are selling their reserve lands faster. This data suggests that. So that's an interesting trend that I wouldn't have known beforehand. No one could have known, but it's worth looking into. Were people selling their land faster? And if so, why? Yeah, why? Doug, we were talking about this in the office. Debt, I would suspect debt is a big topic of conversation in this period in the Myaamia community. Debt is always within the treaties. Debts are absolved through the treaty process.
Yeah, and I wondered in my mind of interacting with traders during that time period if prices weren't inflated for Myaamia people to increase that debt, to push them towards turning this land over.
Yeah. One thing that I'm noticing as a trend, and once the research is complete, we'll know for sure, but there are a lot of the Indian agents and Indian traders that are buying this land, which you might suspect, but we can tell exactly what proportion of acreage, say, someone who's employed by the U.S. government is buying, which, again, we would suspect that these people are plugged in and they can buy the land, but sometimes it's sold for, we could even say, at a discount, maybe. We'll find out once we have all the data. I would say that they're definitely selling it at a discount, sometimes very low, so I don't know what else they're getting out of it, but if Pinjua sells 1 acre, one square mile for $100, that's not the same as other people selling it for $1,000, so that happens. So I wonder what's happening. Asking new questions. This GIS database, and I'll let Doug talk about GIS, but essentially to wrap up, this story of land loss is also a narrative, I think, of land retention over time and a tool for families, Myaamia families, to kind of tell their own stories that I might not have access to and kind of upload their stories if they want into this GIS database. And so I'm not privy to all of those stories, but I know a lot of you are, and if we can set up a tool for you to help you tell your stories, that would be really exciting. So for example, one of the sections that I know somewhat through the record, and a lot of you know much more intimately, is the 10 Sections Reserve, Huntington. This is a communal reserve initially in 1826. It's given to the Myaami tribe, from the Cession aforesaid, the following reservations for the use of the said tribe, that's you guys, shall be made 10 sections at the forks of the Wabash. This is what that polygon looks like. This is the 10 Sections Reserve, which is a communal reserve for the Myaami tribe in 1826, but in 1834, it's patented in fee simple to Pinjua. So principal chief of the Myaami tribe, reserved 10 sections. The process then for me is over time, he did not sell that land. He willed it to his many, many progeny. This is in the Huntington County Recorder's Office, a map, plat of his 10 sections, including the Myaamia names of the people that he bequeathed this land to, which was broken up over time. So this is an example of what happened on a lot of the reserves here. And if you take away that georeference map, this is what that breakdown looks like, parceled out. And in his will, 1841, I devise, will, and bequeath to my 4 grandchildren, the children of Myaamia, I think, is also called Blind-Eyed Richardville. He gave some of that land to grandchildren that he didn't know their names at the time. But if you continue through the recorder's office, you will find these kind of family dynamics at work. By 1849, looking through my database, I found this land being sold just in 1849 by Myaamia, which I don't think we quite got what that name meant, but Myaamia, and she is the grandchild of Pinjua, and she married a guy named Wapapinjia, and so they sold it together to a trader named John Roche for $850 in 1849. Should I? Miss Strauss says he was a crook. So I'm accumulating evidence all the time. This is good. I don't have my pencil, but yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. The same will, another section bequeathed to Katis, Peconge, I believe. Catherine, who married multiple folks. She, Peconge, obtained this section at the forks of the Wabash, modern Huntington, nearby. She then, a few years later, bequeathed to her children that land, including Joseph LaFontaine and Archange LaFontaine, Tacoma, the land where she now resides in 1848, to be divided according to her executor. And this begins, I think, to get us into the story of land retention over a long period of time that's different from just the story of land loss. Because now I think we're getting into a modern era of people recognizing their grandparents on these reserves and having, here's her house, here is a extended family, that is an important family within the Myaami community. Right here, this is Tacoma in the middle with her extended family around her. Myaami people. So when I say kind of a platform to tell stories, if that's something that interests folks, I think we can continue to think about that. So with that, I think we'll let Wamkakamo take over.
Maybe. Hi, Chike. pewe ne la koke. Alonka kama wenza ane, ni la Myaamia nehe mishengo meshe. Amena ta ane ki kaionge. Great to see you all this morning. As Cam described in his part of our presentation about the land loss, the Myaami tribe, the loss of the Myaami tribe's land base in the Great Lakes region, and the challenges involved in researching the transfer of the Myaami people's reserve lands in Indiana. I'm going to talk to you about GIS, its many uses, and how it can be used in conjunction with the research work that Cam has done so far on this project. And most importantly, how we can share this with our Myaamia community and others outside of our community that are interested in this topic. GIS. GIS is an acronym that stands for Graphical Information System. Now, when I first heard this, I had this slight headache right about here, because I was like, oh my God, what is that? So I went on, like everybody does, go on Google, look it up, right? So the definition of GIS is a system designed to capture, store, manipulate, analyze, manage, and display all kinds of spatial or graphical data. I didn't sleep for 3 days after reading that, because I was like, what does that mean? So finally, third night of not sleeping, the light kicked on. Oh, it's more of combining the what with the where. That's really what GIS, and you put the what and the where together, and it describes a particular point in the world, a particular spot in the world. But it can also be used in a historical manner as well, to tell a story about a particular place or a particular event that occurred. GIS can be used in a variety of ways in the real world today. It can be used to track the migration of elk. It can be used to identify invasive plants. It can also be used for mapping utility lines. And then I think everyone here uses GIS, believe it or not. Anybody used Google Maps, right? You ever go on vacation and you're someplace new and you don't know where to eat, and you go to Google Maps and you Google restaurants, and it brings up a list of places with names and their addresses, and sometimes it has website address, website for that place, or it has an actual menu there. So that is the what in a GIS system. That's the information, and that what in GIS we refer to them as attributes. So that is the what. And then if you look at the map and you see the little pinpoint on the map that's for that location, that's the where. That's where that restaurant is physically located. So we all use GIS, I think, in some manner today. GIS can also be used in a historical manner as well. We can use GIS to learn more about a village, or a battlefield, or a battle that took place, or the removal of tribes. So we are taking the research information that Cam has painstakingly collected, about the Indiana reserves, and we're going to apply them to a digital map to tell this story. This information will be placed in a GIS database, and the map is going to have multiple layers. We're going to have a layer that defines these reserves. And then there'll be another layer that will kind of sit on top of that that will show how these lands transition from being in possession of Miami people out of their hands. The what part of this project is the attributes. And part of those attributes for the reserves will be what treaty was this reserve part of? What was the date of that treaty? Who received that reserve? For the sale of properties, it will be about, you know, who was the last Miami to hold that property? Who sold it? Why was it sold? Who was it sold to? For what amount? Those are the kind of attributes that will go into the story. The where will be the physical location of these actual reserves and how those reserves were split up into sections for family members and then sold off. So we got the who, the what, and the where. Now we'll combine them to tell the story. And this final part of this project will be telling the story of land loss of these reserves over time. This will include an interactive map that will allow users to access it via the web. They'll be able to go on here and look at the reserves, and they can click on a reserve and they can see all this information about that reserve, or they can click on a parcel of land and see who owned it last that was part of the tribe, and who sold it and where it went and who it was sold to. Now this is just really the beginning for us. The completion of this map will provide opportunities for future projects. The map layers created in this project can be used in conjunction with, for example, historical ecological maps, to give us an idea of, what was, our Miami connection to that land. And like Cam discussed earlier about the sale of lands and how they seem to accelerate as more treaties came about. There's another opportunity there for us to utilize these maps to do more research and more analyzing and create new maps with new subjects. And then also we can use the GIS database and schema from this project and apply it to looking into the Kansas allotments and the Oklahoma allotments, and maybe get a deeper understanding of how those individual allotments were lost as well. I'd like to close up the presentation today by saying, the Miami people, or the Miami tribe, suffered the loss of their homelands, beginning with a series of treaties between 1795 and 1840. Through the treaty process, individual Miamis were granted private reserves. The Miami people continued to relinquish those reserve lands after 1840. The need arose for us to understand how the Miami people lost ownership of these lands. An incredible amount of time and research went into collecting this information of land loss. This information will be disseminated and put into a GIS database. And an interactive web map will be created that will allow our citizens and the community in general to access this map to better learn and understand how the Myamis ceded this land, or this land came out of their possession over time. The completion of this map marks the beginning of our understanding of the Miami people's connection to the land.